Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of A Week in Watches, which is a weekly look back at interesting watch news, releases, and stories. I'm Zach Weiss, your host and co-founder of Worn & Wound. Thanks for joining me. This week, it's still too hot in New York City, but there has been some interesting launches in the last week at least, so picked up a little bit. If you enjoy this video, please like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. And if you have any questions or any comments, please do leave them below or email them to info@wornandwound.com. This week's sponsor, as you might have guessed, is actually still Wind Up Watch Shop, where we recently added a curated selection of vintage watches from the Wind Vintage collection. So that is owned and operated by Eric Wind. And there'll be an ongoing collection in the shop, so it'll be updating regularly. So please be sure to check in for new editions of cool and stylish vintage watches at windupwatchshop.com. All right, let's get this started. Tissot revisits the 30s with a duo of chronographs. So Tissot is a name that, I think most watch enthusiasts are pretty familiar with. They're part of the Swatch Group, and they're sort of a staple of the affordable Swiss-made watch industry. So they mostly focus on contemporary watches, I'd say leaning a little bit more towards the conservative side of things, but they do occasionally delve into more trendy and niche territory, into vintage and stylized pieces. So recently they actually had a very successful dip into the 70s. For example, their recent PRX line of integrated steel sports watches was a huge hit, and those were in quartz and mechanical and chronographs, and those sort of dipped their toes into some sort of iconic 70s styling at very approachable price points. So they had a real hit there. So that's just an example of them sort of, going and doing something that is a little bit more niche and a little bit more enthusiast driven perhaps. So this week they launched the Telemeter 1938 chronograph in two colorways. So these are classic early 20th century styled multi-scale chronographs featuring two sub-registers at 3 and 9, large Arabic numerals, telemeter scales around the very edge of the dial, which is where the name comes from. But more intriguingly, though not actually included in the name, is that they feature spiral tachometers in the center of the dial, which is a design feature that I personally really enjoy. They also had some nice other details, such as open 6 and 9 numerals wherever they were printed, which just is always like a cool little throwback. There's two versions, silver and black. The silver mixes in white, blue, and red details with blued hands. There's some peeling, contrasting texture there, some nice play in colors and tonality. And then the black version is accented purely by gold. So gold text and gold hands for that, really kind of early 20th century gilt look to it. Both are frankly quite attractive. While the dials are pure history, the cases are definitely more modern. They do have oval pushers and flattened onion crowns, which have some level of vintage feel to it, but they are 42 millimeter cases, so that would have been absolutely massive back in the 1930s. So they are large, modern automatic chronographs in the end of the day. Beating inside is the Valjoux A05.231, which is based on the Valjoux 7750 and features 68 hours of power reserve. I would have preferred for these watches to have been 38 millimeters or under, but Tissot does cater to a very wide audience globally that's a little bit bigger than just us enthusiasts. A number that I do like, however, is the price, which is $1,950. So those are very fairly priced for what they are, particularly Swiss automatic chronographs that are available at retail. Even from Hamilton, which is one of their sibling brands at Swatch Group, an automatic chronograph rarely is below $2K, so they are quite value driven. Next up, we have a double dose of Grand Seiko. So Grand Seiko tends to release watches in torrents, not drips or drabs, so we do have a few to talk about this week. First up is the SBG W291 and 293. So before I get into this, I'll take a step back to pre-A Week in Watches days, when a few months ago they released the SBG W289. So this actually introduced a whole new case, which was a new version of the 44GS case that is part of the 55th anniversary of that design. And we actually covered something similar to that a couple weeks ago. Just as a reminder, the 44GS case, which was 1967, if I have my math correct there, is sort of the quintessential grammar of design case. It has, Zaratsu polished, very flat flanks to it, and really speaks to an aesthetic that is Grand Seiko's and Grand Seiko's alone. So this new version came in at 36.5 by 42.7 by 11.6 millimeters, and that height also includes a box sapphire. So this is actually really quite small for Grand Seiko. Just by comparison, the other 44GS cases, one of which I'm wearing right here, measure 40 by 46.2 millimeters with varying thicknesses depending on the movement that is inside. This is also the first version of the 44GS powered by the 9S64 caliber, which is a manual wound caliber that is date-free. So this is a very clean, classic look to the dial on these. The SBGW289 was a limited edition that featured a subtle pink dial with also a subtle texture to it, and that was made in a quantity of only 1,200 units, which sold out extremely fast, like more or less day of the announcement. I did have a chance to go hands-on with that watch when we have an article that you can go check that out. But it was absolutely gorgeous. It was just like a little jewel of steel. It really showed off their Zaratsu polishing beautifully and had all the same sort of effects that the larger 44GS case has, but just in a smaller, compact, and actually quite thin body. So fans of vintage GS, or those just sinking a smaller version of a 44GS, really, had something to like there. It's also one of the smaller watches Grand Seiko makes, and is comparison to like the SBGW 277 and others like that from the Elegance line. This offers now another small kind of dressy option for people. So the 289 was obviously great, but it sold out. But Grand Seiko didn't develop a new case for just one watch. So the 291 and 293 are the first non-limited versions of the smaller 44GS case. They have much more straightforward dial designs featuring classic sunburst sort of gradients. The 291 is all silver, sort of monochromatic, and that silver almost matches the steel case around it. Has a very nice metal-on-metal look to it, which is something I find quite appealing. And the 293 is actually a dark tobacco brown, which is perhaps the more interesting of the two, just because brown dials are sort of uncommon, particularly as a standard run. So I was excited to see that there. I think that's a really cool option from them. These are both core models, and interestingly, they come on alligator straps rather than bracelets. Previously, most 44GS models came fitted to steel bracelets, which are all nice and good, but I have to say, out of my personal experience, this is a watch that does look a little bit better on a strap. It also will keep the price down a little bit. These watches come in at $5,200 versus the SBGW 289, which was actually $54 because it came on a bracelet. They'll be available in September of 2022, which is just next month. The next release is decidedly more modern and is part of Grand Seiko's sports collection. So they've just added two new steel 9F GMT models, the SBGN 027 and 029. These models come in at 39 by 45.9 by 12.3 millimeters, featuring 19 millimeter lugs and 20 bar water resistance, which is like 200 meters. Both are powered by the 9F86 caliber, which is a high accuracy quartz caliber that is plus minus 10 seconds a year. A year, not a day. That is always mind-boggling to me. So 10 seconds a year, which is fantastic. They also feature true GMTs with local jumping hours, which actually is really interesting that they use that because the accuracy is so high that Grand Seiko didn't want you to adjust the minutes, because if you adjust the minutes, you're going to throw off the accuracy. So by jumping the hour hand around, you're going to be keeping within that 10-second accuracy per year. Both feature fixed steel bezels, split-tone 24-hour chapter rings. The 027 has a black dial with all steel hands for a monochromatic look, which is actually a bit different for the brand. They usually have a pop of color on their GMT hands, and I quite actually like the monochromatic style here. And the 029 is a deep blue with a red hand for sort of that more traditional GMT look. Both are absolutely quite handsome. These watches appear to take after the SBGM 245 and 247 automatic GMTs, which came out sometime in the last year or two, and that is in terms of both the case design and the dial layout. What is interesting is that they don't take after the SBGN 003 005 9F GMTs, which they seem to be more similar to conceptually. Those were actually the first 9F GMTs, and they had these really beautiful twisting lugs to them that I don't believe is actually on really any other Grand Seiko case. I might be wrong there, but to my recollection. And whether or not these new watches are going to replace those, however, is unclear. The SBGN 027 and 029 will retail for $3,300 and also will be available next month. And now it is time for the release of the week. The MII watch returns as the Mechanic 2. Buckle your horological seatbelts. This one's going to take a minute. In 2005, an Uber watch of sorts was released. It was designed actually to be a fundraiser for the Musée International de Horlogerie. Sorry for the pronunciation there. In Chaux de France, Switzerland, and it was self-titled the MIH watch. It was created by then curator of MIH, Ludwig Oxelen. So that's a name that might be familiar to some of you. He was the genius watchmaker behind the Freak and other kind of incredible Ulysse Nardin watches. But more recently is known actually for the Oxen Jr. brand, which is his own brand, which is known for its raw avant-garde style that combines elegant complications that use usually very few components to achieve what they're trying for. That seems to be Ludwig Oxelen's kind of specialty, such as a hyper-accurate moon phase, a perpetual calendar that uses only 9 additional parts, as well as 3 modified parts, such as the dial to tell the date all year round, and as well as the leap year. And my personal favorite, the full dial day-night that features a moon and sun hands, as well as kind of receding baffles along the side of the dial that show the length of the day and night, respectively, in your time zone. They change throughout the course of the year. Really beautiful thing. So he teamed up with Paul Gerber, who's another renowned Swiss watchmaker, who holds many accolades, and one that particularly stood out to me was that he held the Guinness World Record for most complicated wristwatch in 1995. Here's a little blurb from Mr. Gerber's website about it. Starting with a self-striking repeater movement, it's like a minute repeater, by Louis Piguet, Mr. Gerber added a split-second chronograph with flyback function, jumping minute counter, and a power reserve indicator for both the movement and chiming mechanism. After having added a flying tourbillon, over 1,100 parts worked in harmony in this technical masterpiece. So, no small achievement there. So these are 2 absolute horological juggernauts, and there was a third team member as well, Christian Gaffner, which is a name to remember for later in the story. So he's a Swiss industrial designer who has worked across various industries, including watches, clearly, but also for brands such as Oxen Jr. The MIH watch is a unique watch nerd's dream. It combined an annual calendar with a monopusher chronograph, which is a unique combination. The annual calendar is also read in line at 3, like a day date. So often annual calendars will have various subdials and pointer hands and this, that, and the other thing. But this is just a window off at 3 showing you the day, the month. Additionally, it has 2 little dots which function as an AM/PM indicator. Now, when you look at the watch, it will appear simply as a 3-hand watch, as there are no subdials, in which hiding the chronograph function. However, on the back of the watch is a little window through which there is a 30-minute counter disc, which can be read to show the elapsed time from the chronograph, which is just totally rad. Now, this whole thing is based on the Valjoux 7750 movement, so a movement you're probably very familiar with the annual calendar actually being designed by Ludwig Oxelen, which once again added only 9 parts to that movement, which is really crazy. And there's more. This whole contraption is housed in a 42mm titanium case, which you know I love, and featured very short lugs, keeping it as a actually quite compact watch. I've actually seen these in person, and they don't feel like a 42mm watch at all. The design of the case is quite austere, perhaps even severe. It's very sort of a brutalist approach. And the dial, similarly, is very minimal, graphic, and modern. The goal of this watch was just to display the information that was present as quickly as possible. Just featured loom blocks and white print on black with large rectangular hands in white. And if I were to sort of compare this to anything, it sort of reminds me of a mix of the Porsche Orfina chronographs combined with a mundane railway clock. The best part, however, of this epic watch made by a supergroup of watchmakers is that it went for only 6,000 Swiss francs. This is one of the only annual calendar chronographs out there, let alone probably one of the most affordable annual calendars in general. So 6,000 Swiss francs really was a phenomenal price tag. The MIH watch was made for 15 years, from 2005 to 2020, at a rate of 100 watches per year. So a good run, but it was also a real insider watch, and there's not that many out there. But it's back, in spirit at least. Christian Gaffner, the original designer who I mentioned before, acquired the rights to this design and is bringing it back as the Mechanic 2, and that's spelt mechanic with a K at the end. In many ways, it is identical to the original, save two details, one subtle, one less so. So starting with the latter, the backside minute counter was removed, and that has been replaced with a series of apertures on the dial below 12, forming a ring through which a red dot is shown, which will illustrate how many minutes have gone by from the chronograph, the elapsed chronograph minutes. On one hand, it's perhaps a tiny bit less clean, though this is about as minimal of a counter execution as I've seen. On the other hand, it is obviously more functional. Taking the watch off to see the minutes, the elapsed minutes of the chronograph, was quite impractical, as cool as it was. The second difference is that instead of reading MIH at 9, which is the only branding on the watch, it now reads MII or M2. Indicating that it is a sequel to that previous watch. These subtle changes also preserve the uniqueness of the first version, making those 1,500 pieces that do exist, more special, which I think the owners of those watches will be very happy to see. The case, the movement, all the same. And the price, it's gone up a little bit, as you might expect, after 17 years, but not by too much either. So it's coming in at 6,350 Swiss francs, and that's without VAT tax. And that's around $6,700 at this moment. So still a very, very good price for an annual calendar chronograph. I find this very exciting. It's a unique watch with connections to some pretty exceptional contemporary masters, yet it is a total sleeper design. This is a watch for those who appreciate complications with really no need to show off whatsoever. Hopefully with its second life as the Mechanic 2, this is also going to reach a broader audience. The first one came out in 2005, which was before certain blogs like Worn and Wound even existed. And now it will hopefully be commensurate with the growth of the industry and just be, sort of get the attention it deserves. The Mechanic 2 is currently available for pre-order with a 50% deposit and is expected to begin delivery later this year. And that's a wrap for this week's episode of A Week in Watches. Don't forget to head to Worn and Wound Daily for more news and reviews from the watch industry. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.